I got my legs blown off in 2011. A year and a half later, I was on top of Mount Kilimanjaro. At that point, I realized that season of loss had ended and the season of conquering had began.
Someone cares about you.
There's a reason why your heart is beating.
You still have a purpose.
Don't give up.
It's important to know that you're not alone.
You're not alone.
You're not alone.
You are not alone.
Today, I'm talking with Mark Zambon. He's a former Marine Corps EOD Staff Sergeant, two-time Purple Heart recipient, an ambassador for the nonprofit The Heroes Project, and current law student seeking to become a criminal defense attorney specializing in serving veterans with PTSD and mental health conditions. Mark, welcome to the 1 Mile, 1 Veteran podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'd love to get started from the beginning of your journey. What was life like before you decided to join the Marine Corps?
So life for me before the Marine Corps, I joined right after high school. So, I would describe it as the normal kind of just childhood coming up, and grew up in Michigan in more of a rural area where, for several generations at least, hunting deer was a means of supplementing groceries, back in Michigan. So, we grew up with firearms and my dad reloaded his own ammunition. So, incidentally, as kids, it just turned out we had access to smokeless powder and black powder. And, from a very young age, developed a fascination for, energetic devices, things that go boom. And one time in my junior year in high school, I was in the Marine Corps recruiter with a friend, and they had this flip book, with pages of different military jobs and then a picture that corresponds with that skill set. And was flipping through the book, and I got to this page that had two Marines in green camouflage uniforms laying on their bellies on this dirt berm. And 500 yards in front of them was this giant fireball detonation. And the other page was explosive ordnance disposal. And I looked up at the recruiter and I was like, you can get paid to blow stuff up. And, acting the cool guy, the recruiter was like, yeah, we got that, And so I was basically sold at that point. The idea of becoming an explosives expert, for the United States military, the Marine Corps at that, was just a thrilling idea for me as a 17-year-old. And that would have been in 2002. So, 9/11 had already taken place. And in my mind, nothing, materialized that the improvised explosive device would be a weapon system of choice of the folks that we would be fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that, becoming a EOD tech, explosive ordnance disposal tech, would, bring me to that place of being the one to defeat those IEDs in combat. But as it played out, that was kind of a dream come true. So, yeah, my childhood, kind of normal Midwest childhood, grew up a lot of outdoor sports, snowboarding, dirt biking, jet skiing in the summertime, skiing, snowboarding in the wintertime. Wasn't super academically motivated in any capacity. So, when the end of high school was coming around, it was what to do with life. And the Marine Corps was hiring and it had some really exciting opportunities. So I jumped on.
The Marine Corps was hiring with some exciting opportunities. I love that mentality. Now, when you were looking at the explosive ordnance disposal, did you do any further research other than we get to blow some stuff up?
So learning a bit about the broader mission of, explosive ordnance disposal. So all four of our branches, I learned, all have their own EOD component of them. And that besides just general demolition, it's a specialized training in every type of weapon system that utilizes explosives, from nuclear, chemical, biological, to improvised, like we're seeing in the battlefields in Afghanistan, in Iraq, to all the conventional munitions that, our country and the world produces, from landmines and grenades, to rockets, to dispensers and payloads, to aircraft delivered bombs. All those things are trained on. And The explosive ordnance disposal technician is competent on staying safe in and around them, the handling of them, the rendering them safe from an armed or dangerous condition to a less than hazardous, to and through their final disposal, be it through detonation or burning or inerting. And so I definitely did a lot more research in my plan, because in the Marine Corps, you can't go into the Marine Corps right from the boot camp pipeline to be a bomb tech like you can in the Air Force and the Army and now the Navy. The Marine Corps, you still have to become a sergeant first and then apply to change your job to do a lateral move to become an EOD technician. So my idea or my plan was to be a combat engineer first, get a bunch of experience in like general demolition and explosive breaching, landmine, employment and recovery, and then transfer to become a bomb tech. So I did do a little bit more research into becoming an EOD tech before I made the plunge. And then, during my first tour in Fallujah in 2004 in Iraq, I got to speak to the first EOD tech Marines that I'd ever met before. And there were these two sergeants that I first met, and I was a Lance Corporal at the time. This is 2004. And I remember they were both playing the cool guy. They're like, yeah, this is C4 right here. We use it pretty much every day, so it's not very cool anymore. And I was just at that point in my mind, I was like, C4 will never not be cool, no matter what. It's no matter how long if I get to become a bomb technician, C4 will never not be cool. That's always an exhilarating thing in my mind. And so that, left a lasting impression, and seeing the nature of that IED fight in Iraq in particular in those years, 2004, 2005, really drove home the need for it. And what the Marine Corps did during that time was issue a Marine admin that allowed Lance Corporals to change jobs. So a much lower rank were able to perform a lateral move or change their job. This is early 2005. And I had just gotten home from that tour in Iraq, and the EOD community for the Marines, they were doing a road show to all the different bases throughout the country. And you could go, apply with them and, demonstrate you meet all the entrant qualifications and do some tests where, where you wear the bomb suit, you do basic mechanical skill tests, see if you can keep your cool, demonstrate that you're not claustrophobic, and, write a letter, interview with various officers. And so I got accepted as a Lance Corporal in 2005 to do a lateral move and attend the Naval School Explosive Ordnance Disposal down in Eglin Air Force Base, Florida. So that's kind of how it came together.
Wow. What a fortuitous turn of events in terms of your career desires. And as a bomb technician, EOD technician, I understand that you had a very intense career. You even served shortly after the Haditha massacre near where I was deployed. Would you mind talking about a bit of your service and when it ended up occurring?
Yeah, totally. So, I had done 2 back-to-back tours as a Lance Corporal in 2004, 2005 when I was with 1st Combat Engineer Battalion. I had open contract enlisted, and they put me in supply admin. And so I was the supply clerk for Bravo Company, 1st CEB. And then when 2nd Combat Engineer Battalion were coming into country, their supply clerk for their company had literally deserted before their flight. So they arrived into Fallujah without someone to do my job. So they're like, hey, will you stay back for, 3 months and train our warehousemen in on how to do all the supply requisition, software use, the records of all the, itemized and serialized gear and vehicles and so forth. And I was like, I'm single dude, I'm 19, happy to. So I stayed back and did a 3-year kind of training workup with one of their Marines, and then ended up going up to the regimental level after that because I had some friends, regimental logistics, and finished that tour out back to back. So I had kind of done 2 back-to-back tours for my first bit. And then after EOD school, which is 8 months of really kind of technical performance-based tests, that I almost failed out of. There's this one test that I failed 3 times. I triple tapped it. And if you fail something twice for the first time, they drop you from your class and you have to pick up with the next class that goes through it. And then when you take that test again, you don't get 2 chances like you do normally. If you fail that test again for a third time, you're automatically dropped from that class. And normally at that time, that person is dropped from EOD school and they're sent back to their original unit. But very thankfully, the staff there at EOD school gave me another shot, and I was able to pass that test and then, not fail anymore, but one other test all the way through EOD school. And it's super easy to fail there. Not that the stuff is like so difficult, but they have what they call a 16-point hit, and you have to get an 85% score to pass all your tests. So like basic stuff like, misidentifying a fuse or a piece of, explosive ordnance, or, violating a certain safety procedure, that may cause the item to detonate, are considered 16-point hits. And I remember I'd mis-ID'd like a fuse or something and had gotten, dropped for a third time. But anyways, or a second time. So passed EOD school, joined first explosive ordnance disposal company out at Camp Pendleton in California. And I just gotten like my first vehicle before that. I got a Kawasaki Ninja ZX636 with deployment cache. So I road tripped that motorcycle with a backpack from Florida up to Washington, D.C., to Michigan, to Montana, down to Camp Pendleton, and joined first EOD company. And that would have been 2006. And then, basically got on the deployment cycle where we did a training workup and deployed in early 2007 to Iraq. And that was in support of 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, with you guys out of Hawaii there. And, by that time, the kind of gunfire and that kind of the amounts of troops in contact had really quieted down, and it was like all IEDs, but I think the bomb makers and emplacers in Haditha were well known to, pack a big punch and have some, massive IEDs. Like, we were reading some of the incident reports before arriving at Haditha, and, reading incident reports where like the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, fighters had like packed whole culverts with like 1,000 pounds of explosives, and just waylaying vehicle convoys. And so that was the nature of that tour for us, was just a lot of IED work. I think, one time we got a pop shot taken at us, but lots of improvised explosive devices, command initiated, where they'll have like, command wire or radio controlled triggers, and then, a person watching the vehicle convoys or people on foot, and they'll have like target reference points set up, kind of like front and rear sight aiming posts. And then when the target is aligned, they'll initiate that. Or victim actuated stuff like pressure initiated were real common, or also with the use of like military ordnance and, bulk stores of rocket propellant, like 55-gallon barrels full of rocket propellant as, an explosive main charge. It was a lot of IED work that tour for sure. And then, pivotally that tour, my teammate was killed by a real tricky come-along style device that kind of baited us into the scenario with something that was like non-functional, but you could tell it was put there for a reason, that was trying to get, one or more of our team to walk out all these strands of command wire that were placed along the road that they had seen us walk before. And at one of those lengths of that command wire, they buried another pressure-initiated explosive device that my teammate's boot eventually stepped on and initiated, and that explosion killed him. And then from that tour, I did 3 more tours as a bomb tech, all in Afghanistan after that. And, it was all a fantastic effort, to just keep people safe and try to remove those threats. And, further perfect those skills as a bomb tech of, being comfortable in that place of chaos and being able to operate on that very threshold of explosives from that point of initiation to that point of safety, as time would permit and the mission would permit, and, keep everyone safe.
As you're sitting there describing that first tour to Iraq as an EOD technician, it was just bringing back a lot of memories of what we were encountering. And, I can't express enough gratitude because it was gentlemen like you that had allowed me to come home, as well as many of my friends. And so, that work that you were doing is so incredibly important to bringing people home, reuniting children with their parents, fathers with their kids, mothers with their sons and daughters. And, thank you very much for that. And I know it wasn't an easy job to do when you're losing friends as well, because the enemy got more and more sophisticated. And I understand that you yourself actually received 2 Purple Hearts on 2 separate deployments. Would you mind sharing a little bit about that and the impact that it had on you?
Yeah, totally. So the 2 Purple Hearts I received, the first one was a Taliban improvised detonator. I was attempting to disassemble to run it through a test machine that we had. We've gotten some intel of a new kind of bomb crew entering the area, and the chemical profile of their improvised detonators was known, what they were using. So I was attempting to take this one apart like we had done several others to run it through the test machine that we have in order to determine what the chemical makeup of these improvised detonators that they were supplying were using. And the detonator ended up detonating in my hand while I was taking it apart and blew off 3 of my fingertips, and kind of the quintessential EOD type injury, bomb tech injury, you're missing your fingers and toes. And the rule in country in Afghanistan at the time was that if you had to spend more than 11 days in recovery, they had to medevac you back to the States. So they sent me back, did my recovery, just 30 miles south of Camp Pendleton at the Naval Medical Center in San Diego. Went through all the ringers of the C5 department they have there, the Complex Combat Casualty Care Center, and a fantastic, model of healthcare where everyone who's entered gets assigned a recovery care coordinator to handle their administrative issues, a medical care case manager to coordinate across all the various medical disciplines to the care they need and work face-to-face with the individual, and then all the relevant disciplines of medicine that someone could need care from when they suffer, traumatic injuries. And, one of those being the prosthetist. And I remember I went in and spoke to the prosthetist there at Balboa at the time, showed him my fingers. I was like, did they make any kind of finger prosthetics for this? And he's like, unfortunately, no, you would have had to have lost another joint level down before finger prosthesis would be qualified. So after about a month, I got returned by the medical staff there to return to full duty. And this was in 2010. And so First EOD company at that time was in a workup state to send the next volley of 2 platoons over to Afghanistan, to Helmand province, to relieve who had deployed in the spring, which the teams that I had gone out with. And, it was an interesting place because no one was asking me to redeploy, but I knew they needed experienced team leaders. And, it's like ever since my teammate Mike was killed on that tour in 2007, I just had this debt of gratitude that I'd felt was impossible to express towards him. Like I wanted to say thanks so much for him, for bearing witness to the gift that he gave and giving his life, for all of us and what we believe in, and just that level of commitment to each other, right? Where, their last breath is surrendered, in recognition of going forward and doing one's best and all these things. And I can never say thanks, but I realized after my fingers were blown off, I was like, if I go back and redeploy, that would be me going above and beyond what's asked of me, to the extent that it would be a way I could demonstrate that thanks and that gratitude, back to Mike for giving his life by redeploying again. And so deployed that fall of 2010, this time in support of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, back to Helmand Province. And then they took over the Sangin area of operations from 3-7, 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines that had done kind of a left seat, right seat changeover with the British forces that had been there for the last several years. and, took a team, trained them up, hit the ground running. And, we were doing great things, just trying to keep people safe as best we could. And then halfway through that tour, I had a anti-personnel style improvised explosive device, pressure initiated with just a pressure switch that you step on, put enough force. It was buried in the rubble of an adobe wall that the Marines had explosively breached maybe a week prior. And as it turned out, this 15-year-old kid had gotten a full-built IED from the Taliban and had buried it in the rubble. And as we were going single file, Ranger file, on foot to the scene of this IED that one of the squads of India 3-5 had discovered, this 15-year-old kid's mother was coming up from us perpendicularly, just yelling at us, but we didn't have an interpreter with us, and I didn't speak Pashtun, and apparently she was trying to warn us that her child had buried, a victim-actuated bomb in the rubble. And so, the lead sweeper didn't find it with his mine detector. It was a low metallic improvised explosive device. Didn't finger sweep the area, obviously, with the hopes that he would have located that. And, I was coming from downhill, so I didn't see eyes on when they had crossed that. The infantry squad leader crossed over it. Their squad's corpsman stepped over it. My two guys stepped over it. And then, when it was my turn to cross the breach, I just remembered my eyes shutting, connecting with a blackness and hearing kind of like an audible click. And then coming to very shortly later in this kind of comfortable warmth. And my mind was like, wait, something just happened. It's was that a bomb? Did I get blown up? And then I remembered hearing one of the fire team leaders' voices on the radio on my kit, and I recognized it, asking if we were okay. And, I just delivered a Chuck Norris thumbs up on the ground. And, remember hearing the squad leader's voice, yelling at people don't step there, hasn't been swept yet, and all this. And, the corpsman and my assistant team leader got tourniquets on my legs probably within a minute, I would say, but still tons of blood loss. But, had it been for their efforts, no doubt I would have died very quickly. And they were carrying me out, my assistant team leader and the corpsman. And I looked up at my AA/ my assistant team leader, and I was like, hey, Dan, I was like, are my legs gone? And he's like, yeah, they're gone. And it just the night before, this was in January in Afghanistan, it was real cold and we'd been super busy. Just the previous day, I think we worked 9 or 10 IEDs in one day. And I remember taking off my boots and my double, woolen cotton socks I was wearing, and I was sitting on my cot, cross-legged style, holding my feet. And I remember the cool, clammy sensation of the skin of my feet struck me. It was I haven't felt my feet in a while. And I was like, oh, how would I feel if I lose them? And I was like, well, I wouldn't pity myself. I wouldn't be sad for it, but I would look forward to progress and prosthetics and, be grateful for all the adventures I've got to have with my legs, up to this point, all the motorcycle trips and the music festivals and all the adventures, and that was the day before my legs were blown off. And, so that was my second Purple Heart right then and there. And when the Commandant of the Marine Corps presented that to me at that time in 2011, he said this thing. He's like, when you finish your recovery, he's like, and you want to keep serving, and he's like, and I know you will. He's like, we're going to keep the door open for you. So after I completed my recovery and, climbed Mount Kilimanjaro and raced the Dakar in South America, did career course as a staff sergeant without legs, applied for and got the expanded permanent limited duty and returned to duty teaching bomb disposal at the Naval School, explosive ordnance disposal, combat boots and prosthetic legs. And that was the important marker for me, because everyone that I knew before me that had lost both their legs, it was a career ender. So after you get blown up and you're sitting in that hospital bed with all these kind of mega realizations that, one of which is this dream job you have is now done, to demonstrate that that's not the case was something I was really, proud to have accomplished.
You just glossed over so much of what had happened. Mark, that's an incredible mindset to have. Not lost on the fact that you were reflecting on the gratitude that you would have if something happened. The next day, something happens. And How do you go about having that mindset of, I just suffered this polytrauma, and then during the recovery process, you're given an opportunity to continue your service, which, like you had mentioned, wasn't something that was historically happening within any branches of the service up to that point, because the technology just wasn't to the point where we could continue to allow service members to give of themselves. So how do you have that mindset to overcome and not let the dark thoughts overwhelm you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so much of life is a matter of perspective. And, it's like whenever I think I have it bad, I know people that are like triple or quadruple amputees. And then whenever I think of that, I think of the friends that were killed and that are no longer even alive, and I remember it was maybe the same year I lost my legs or the year after it. And I was hanging out with a Gold Star father, one of my best buddies that was killed, his dad, and another Russian friend who another group of us had, all met in Afghanistan. He was a journalist, the Russian was. And, of course, he brought some top class vodka. So the vodka was flowing. And I was having this conversation with my buddy Josh's dad. And there was this moment in the conversation where I felt like he was looking through me and speaking to his son. And in that moment, I connected with this like truth that it doesn't matter that I lost my legs. From a father's perspective, if your son was still there, you can put your arms around your son, tell jokes, and like go have fun, go fishing, whatever, hang out. Even if you're missing your legs, like it doesn't matter. Just what matters is to be alive. And that kind of, was a realization that I had early on in that recovery. And so a matter of perspective that no matter how bad these moments are, everything in life is going to have its season. Even if, something in life is permanent, like I don't have my legs, they haven't come back, but yet seasons of like more acute recovery have passed, and seasons of like, championing an injury arrive and come and go. But the most important thing is, to be alive. And I think that that's been a central realization for this experience of having my legs blown off for me, almost dying just from blood loss. But then having a chance to start anew, like from the square roots of just what it is to be in existence, and the profound gift and winning of that just from square one. So I think, no matter how bad things get for me, that's always been something that's apparent, that's helped as a guide on the path.
That's really incredible. And you had mentioned during your recovery process that you did some pretty incredible adventures like climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. How did you come about discovering those opportunities and incorporating that into your rehabilitation?
Yeah, no doubt. So the Kilimanjaro recovery track came about my way. I think I could describe it, at the 30,000 foot level, of the community of our nation and the desire that exists within our country, to function as a strong community in togethership, and a nonprofit that was formed by a former Hell's Angel who himself was in a bad motorcycle accident and had doctors tell him he'll never walk again, got pins and rods all through his spine and, limb salvage for a foot. And, when he was told that by a doctor, sparked a fire in him, and he went on to climb Mount Everest after a second attempt. And so, this man, Tim Medvets, started a nonprofit to offer the mountain climbs of the tallest summits in the world to veterans that had lost limbs after he met a veteran who had sustained an amputational injury in combat. He met him on a flight. And so, it was in Tim's direction of seeing that mission realized that, we met on Camp Pendleton one day at a Lieutenant Dan band concert with Gary Sinise. And I was sitting in the concert audience out in like the Lake O'Neill area, under the sun in Camp Pendleton with my buddy Jimmy, who he and I had been on a team the tour I Lost My Fingers, drinking a cold beer. I was in my wheelchair and this giant hulk of a 6'5" dude comes up to me and like eclipses the sun over me. And I look up from my chair and, here's this Hulk voice like, "Hey man, you ever climb mountains?" And we just gotten back from Telluride with the rec therapists there at the Naval Medical Center in San Diego. And it's like, "Yeah, man, I just got back from Telluride. I climbed like this 30-foot rock face, with this like pull-up device and didn't have to use my legs." And he's like, "No, man, like real mountains." And I was like Kilimanjaro? He's like, "Yeah, like Kili." And I was like, "No." And so from above comes this hand with a business card, and one side is like the American flag, the other side is like two, climbers doing like a cliffhanger. It says the Heroes Project. He's like, "Give me a call if you want to climb a mountain." And this was maybe on a Friday or Saturday. And I thought about it over that weekend. I was like, the long-term gains and like getting over this injury and the effects that it's having, and who knows how to do that, are definitely going to be outweighed by the short-term suffering, what's entailed for training for and doing this climb. So I called him and emailed him on Monday, and he's like, "I'm game on, count me in." And, from that point was kind of patched into the whole, all right, here's how we're going to do your resistance training, swim training, yoga training, hiking. We got to get different equipment, different prosthetic legs. And it was a matter of figuring all that out, because I was also his first bilateral above knee climber. So there was a lot of organic considerations different to like center of gravity and prosthetic legs for a bilateral above knee amputee than like a single leg amputee that has to stay at their normal height. But for me, I cannot use prosthetics with an articulating knee, but just use like stubbies that have like a 6-inch long leg. So it drops my center of gravity way down. So there's much less of a fall risk while on steep pitches. And instead of like instead of trekking poles or canes, I got connected to this Australian climber, a bilateral AK above knee amputee. And he's like, forearm crutches are the way to go. So, they kind of have like a cuff that goes around your forearm, and you hold a handle, and you're able to utilize your upper body strength as a means of stability and propulsion. And so, yeah, once we got that climb training package down, it was like probably 8 months over the winter of, just literally being a professional athlete, 8 hours of training a day, plus, great nutrition, great rest, getting in shape for Kilimanjaro.
I love that you said yes to continuing to push yourself, and the fact that there is a nonprofit like the Heroes Project to kind of facilitate these types of adventures for veterans and people with your type of trauma. What was the most challenging part of the climb of Mount K, and how did you overcome it?
I think the most challenging part of the climb of Mount Kilimanjaro, honestly, was the training leading up to it and how much pain that I had to just push through, that essentially wasn't pain of new injuries occurring, but after you lose your limbs, the nerves are essentially amputated, obviously, but then they have to regrow out in a healthy pattern. And so, you can get, the human body can develop these neuromas that are like bundles of nerves that are painful when stimulated instead of just normal sensation. And so all this work in prosthetics and the sockets was super painful. But it took understanding that it wasn't new injury occurring with that pain. It wasn't like, okay, I need to stop. Pain is happening here. Let me readjust. It was actually, okay, this is just the pain of my body getting used to these new pressures, these like unconventional pressures of, wearing a carbon fiber socket over a residual limb and bearing your body weight in it for, a whole day's climbing. And so it was pushing through a lot of that I would say was the most difficult. By the time we got to Kilimanjaro, our summit day push was a 16-hour climb day. And at the end of that, like, I was still feeling fresh. That, the climb leader, Tim, he still says he regrets, not optioning my climb to be Everest as a bilateral above knee amputee, because we'd reached such a solid level of fitness and capability after that 8 months of training. So the climb itself wasn't too challenging. Kilimanjaro was 19,341 feet. And you can take routes like the one that we did that are non-technical. So you're basically hiking, the length of Mount Kilimanjaro, where the big challenge is how does one's body handle altitude? And there were quite a few people that we started out around the same time that either passed us or we ran into at some point that we saw that were turning around on summit day or the day before without summiting because they were exhibiting signs of altitude sickness like pulmonary edema, blue lips, people getting carried down on porters' backs and having altitude-related medical emergencies. So that was probably the biggest wild card. We had done training above 10,000 foot elevation, or actually above 7,000 foot elevation most weekends during the training workup at Mount Baldy, right at the East Los Angeles County, West San Bernardino County lines. So to kind of get the body used to that mode where you're producing more blood cells to handle that lower oxygen content in higher elevated heights. And so, I felt like my body handled the altitude great. We had Diamox on hand, that prescription supplement you can take that helps with altitude sickness, but it's also a powerful diuretic. So it was one of those things that, like, if you didn't need to take it, don't take it. And we didn't need to. But Kilimanjaro was an epic gift, because on that summit push, it was July 2012, year and a half after my legs were blown off. We were arriving at the rim of the crater of the volcano, Mount Kilimanjaro, right as the sun was coming up, and the moon was still up in the east. So there was a point reaching the rim where, you look out to the east and the sun is coming up. You look out to the west and the full moon is on the other side of the horizon. And then what is illuminated is the expanse of the Serengeti Desert. Like Kilimanjaro isn't a part of a mountain range. It's a standalone volcano in this, flat safari land of the Serengeti. And it was one of those moments in life that is just, cloud nine, just epic visual and, the experience of, succeeding in that climb. And I'd done it with the dog tags of, two of my best buddies that were killed. And, it was one of those moments that was like, wow, if this moment can be so incredible, why can't any other moment at any other point in life be this majestic? Like if a human life can be jazzed to experience this moment as I was in that moment, it's like, why isn't any moment, able to be just recognized of just the triumph of existence, right? Just like that happened on the top of the mountain. And I was thinking that, and then I also realized at that point, right, talking about like how the seasons of things come and go. And I was like, the season of my leg loss has now come to a completion at this point. And I felt like the season of conquering the injury started right there, and we further pushed up to the summit, took out my digging knife that had last, cut into like Afghan soils, digging up their buried bombs, and, found a place out in the back and, cut into that black ash soil of the Kilimanjaro volcano and took off the dog tags of my two closest buddies that were killed. One on that tour in 2007 in Iraq, and then 2010 in Afghanistan, and, just contemplated their lives and remembered them and, buried their dog tags up there to kind of, create that place in the world where, their memories, their identities, their existence beyond this physical plane, might check in and enjoy some sweet African views, So that was Kili for the most part.
Sounds like such an amazing experience, Mark, and quite an accomplishment. I mean, it really, I really hear the impact on your personal growth and perspective on life that the Heroes Project has had on you. And with this experience being, just over 10 years ago at this point, how have we do know that, or at least I know from personal experience, that there are some still like lingering symptoms within mental health and physical injuries that plague a lot of veterans. How do you experience some of these lingering symptoms, and how do you deal with them in your daily life?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely still experience symptoms. Like the flat out truth is that I don't have my legs. And so the frustrations of wheelchairing and breaking wheelchairs, and prosthetics not working are frustrations that are still part of almost every day. And it's really difficult, because if you don't have a positive mindset to examine these things through, it's so easy to get on that embittered train and just start cussing out, all these medical devices all the time and just like being pissed off. And really not a whole lot of good comes out of that, just kind of embroils the nervous system, and it's not healthy. And that's been something that I've been arriving at in recent years of my life, like 10-year plus mark of losing my losing my legs, where I've really been trying to have a focused effort at retooling my mindset and approach towards all these hardships in life. And when that opportunity presents itself to be just frustrated or angered or furious about, these continual frustrations that never abate, instead of just riding that and getting all, kind of royally pissed, to extend or to instead just step off that and be like, just do what you have to do to get this done and move on. I heard this quote of Chinese wisdom, I believe, that said that, if you know the outcome of something, then don't, get frustrated over the process in the meanwhile, paraphrasing that. I know if I have to do, X, Y, Z with my prosthetics, even though it's so inconvenient and such a laborious effort, to still do it and not get tripped up about it, because, there's really no way getting around it. And that's as far as the prosthetics related things go. As far as mental health care, I find it tough, as I'm sure many veterans do, in accessing good mental health care through the VA, through DOD insurances, through school, insurance. That, we hear in our country there's a critical shortage of mental health care providers. But if you see how difficult it is, my wife's in her psychology graduate track right now, and she graduated summa cum laude in her bachelor's and didn't get in on her first applications to her various master's or PhD programs. A 4.0, summa cum laude graduate, you see how difficult it is and how long it takes, like 8 or 9 years to produce, a PsyD or PhD holding psychologist. That, it's almost like we have this national shortage of mental health providers, but it's also exceptionally difficult to train them. And the systems of our schools throughout the country don't seem to be optimally positioned to produce those mental health care providers that can provide that help. And I don't think the VA escapes that. I'm sure they have shortage issues across the country between the Department of Veterans Affairs and vet centers, and having mental health care providers staffing their roles. So, the mental health care piece has been a continual challenge as well. And, the need that I've had talking about, developing a positive outlook to look through these things, like positive psychology, that tries to embrace that kind of optimistic outlook, as I understand it. It has been something I've been trying to connect to for a while. And I have an appointment booked, I think in June or July, with the VA in Los Angeles, to, attempt to get back in, care to try to work on that. But in the meanwhile, it's just putting one foot in front of the other, kind of shifting, into first gear and taking it day by day as needed, to just get through. So, I was just talking to another veteran, a fellow combat amputee, just the other day, and we were comparing, the nature of our care post-combat, where, we got inducted in that C5 system, and this fantastic medical care delivered, to include mental health care, to the point that you're cleared by the mental health care providers as, essentially having access to all the treatment that, you either need or would like to access at that point in time. And, compare that to veterans that, do combat deployments that aren't, exposed to the polytrauma of explosive blasts and lose limbs that, organically separate from the Marine Corps. And they quite likely were not plugged into mental health care at any point during that time. So, regarding PTSD, a good friend, a Vietnam veteran, puts it a certain way, and he's like, going to war is like crossing a stream. He's like, we all get wet, and it's a matter of how you dry out on the other side. And for veterans to separate from the service and not know anything about PTSD or what it looks like or how it manifests or how their life might be changing, they might be compartmentalizing their life in such a way where it's like, they just go straight to work or straight to school and back home. They don't go out to parks or concerts or all the things that, they might used to have done for enjoyment before. And, that's part of PTSD, and it's not understood as that. And, when someone sees that in their life, that should be a light going off that, recognizing a need to go get care. So I think a lot of people that get out that, the figures from the Global War on Terror, something like 30% of veterans that served in combat are gaining a PTSD diagnosis upon return home, and the DoD hasn't met that with, the awareness, creating awareness of the symptoms of PTSD and then how to access care. We get post-deployment screenings on how we're doing on, basic 1 to 5 scales and blah, blah, blah. And everyone basically knows that in order to go home and see your friends and family on leave, you have to, fill these things out to make it look like everything's cool, and meanwhile, for a lot of people, that's not the situation. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in our military and the VA continuing to help address post-traumatic stress and its treatment, and also the stigma behind mental health as well, where just like a physical injury, you break a leg, you go get care. If you're experiencing mental injuries as well, we have providers, and that care is just as appropriate and adequate and needed to get, to care for us. It's like one way I think about this, it's like we literally occupy bodies that we don't even entirely understand. Like we can't take a cadaver brain and pull whole memories from that cadaver brain as a simple example of we don't know how memories are entirely stored in the brain. So that this being that we occupy exceeds our own intelligence. And so our attempts at mental health care, are from that kind of handicapped place of understanding, so to speak. And, I think our mental health sciences have always been trying to do the best they can, and we're continually improving. And, it's prudent on all of us, whenever we need to get care, to go get it, because that's the best that's out there right now. And who knows, it's like what the product of these, participating care, be it group therapy, or individualized sessions with a provider, can produce or help other people, or just sharing that perspective of what we've been through and other people maybe going through similar things and being encouraged, through what someone's gone through. So, embracing it when needed is super important.
I love that you've really developed this thought process for yourself that you can choose to be angry about something and complain and moan and let the negative thoughts overwhelm you and that become part of your life, or you can choose to acknowledge that there are frustrations in life, and frustrations are a part of what we experience on a day-to-day basis, whether they're due to combat PTSD or just regular life. And I know that you've also chosen to do something about it in terms of the things that you see as atrocities towards the veteran community by seeking an education in law in order to help veterans that may not fully have an understanding and end up suffering consequences as a result of actions committed in the midst of a mental health crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. My mentor in Marine EOD, who is a lion in the EOD field and inspired so much courage, me included. He worked over 800 IEDs, in the most violent years of the war in Iraq and Ramadi and Fallujah. And, when I think about that 800 roadside bombs, that's easily 1,000 people's lives or limbs or both that are intact because the actions of one person. And, he walked away from his combat experience with very impactful PTSD and, broke the law several times in Florida, nothing of, much violence towards others really, but just himself. And my wife and I went out to Florida to advocate for him outside the courthouse for a week leading up to his hearing. And we're present in the hearings and listened how his public defender had hired a state psychologist, a mental health witness, who took the stand and said that my friend's actions were driven by his symptom of depression. And there was no mention of his military service connected PTSD whatsoever. And, to see him do 4 years between county and state and, his PTSD symptoms, his anxiety severely exacerbated, as well as a lack of mental health care while in county jail in particular, as well as really poor living conditions and food literally labeled unfit for human consumption. And apparently when they would have a state inspector come through, they would switch it out to some ground chuck. And then when they'd leave, it was back to, literally food labeled not fit for human consumption. And so seeing this really shoddy job that my friend got with a public defender, which probably would have been a lot better had he had the funds to pay for a competent criminal defense. But he didn't, and a lot of people don't, because you're probably looking at least $30,000 to pay, for a criminal law attorney through some serious felonies, mid-level serious felonies, and further, how PTSD was not mentioned at all in his case, motivated me to go that route. So I was already in the psychology route for my undergrad with the hopes of getting a PhD in psychology to work in resilience-based modalities. Resiliency training for military or law enforcement or any kind of job that expects to come across trauma, because that's what I felt like I got to experience in my military career, was like a gradual buildup to trauma, where my first exposures weren't as visceral and violent as, later ones with, my own body being taken apart by explosive devices and best friends being killed. To try to work on modalities to create that mental toughening for folks. And then after seeing my mentor in EOD, go through this process, motivated me to go the law school route. And in my last semester of my undergrad, I was in a neuroscience lab, led by a PhD, a Yale PhD graduate, and learning what the neuroscience research is revealing, in that a high correlation, a high connection between PTSD and a downregulation of the part of the brain that deals with decision making and impulsivity and judgment. So you can connect these dots and see that if a person suffers PTSD, and in this case, what we're talking about is military service related, be it from military sexual trauma or combat, and gains that diagnosis, that condition is correlated in our research with a downregulation with the front of the frontal cortex, the part of the brain that deals with things like judgment, decision, and impulsivity. So very well, this military service connected injury can play a role in people's commitments of crimes. And so if a military service injury plays a role in a veteran's commitments of a crime, that absolutely needs to be a part of that narrative in the courtroom. That needs to be taken into consideration. And our VA right now, for several years or maybe a decade plus, has had the Veterans Justice Outreach Program that they work hand in hand with over 200 counties throughout the nation and their veterans treatment courts to do sentencing diversion. But that's after the court cases are adjudicated or a plea deal agreed to. And it only at best will handle up to low-level felonies. So when a veteran commits something beyond a low-level felony and they qualify for an indigent defense, a public defender, the VA has no necessary role in helping kind of shepherd their process through and looking out and as that responsible source of caring for men and women that serve our country when they're in the criminal legal system, as well as the nonprofit world. All the reaching that we did out to the 501c3 sector for the veteran world, when it comes to criminal law and judicial matters, everyone that we reached out to, they're like, we're hands off. And the couple veteran legal nonprofits that I've come across, they deal exclusively with civil law, nothing related to criminal law or felonies. So it's like, well, here's a need. I have the opportunity at hand to do something about it. So that motivated that change to go the law school route. with the goal of, working in criminal law, representing veterans with PTSD with the best understanding our latest neuroscience is producing. And as a core focus, seeing about their accessing rehabilitative services versus being incarcerated. And, this very well may be something need to be addressed legislatively at a national level, because veterans all over the country that are in this predicament that, if they commit a crime over a low-level felony, and they can't afford a competent criminal defense attorney, very well may be just like thrown to the wolves and become, profit fodder for the prison industry, versus being very fairly regarded, with regards to why they did these things, and was PTSD an influencing factor in it, and is it right to incarcerate our war heroes when their actions are motivated by injuries that they took on in service of our country. So that's kind of the core focus and the end goal. I would like to form a posse of attorneys and, we go work under the umbrella of public defenders and veteran clients throughout the country and just bolster their defense and bring as best of a defense to that veteran's behalf as possible.
Well, I'm so grateful, Mark, that there are men and women like yourself that see this problem looming and are taking steps necessary to begin to overcome them. And I know that the process of change is long, especially when it comes to nationwide litigation. But it's so necessary to make sure that we continue to provide these services to our nation's veterans. And I know that if there's anybody to accomplish it, it's somebody like yourself that maintains this positive mindset and is able to mobilize people into action. So I appreciate you so much for sharing your journey with us here at 1 Mile 1 Veteran. And I have one last question for you before I let you go, and that is, what would you say to somebody that is currently going through a mental or physical struggle right now?
Yeah, I would say, the thing that I've learned, and I talked about it a bit in the podcast, is, the realization that everything has its season in life, right? And that some things might seem more permanent, more long-term, but until they're given, time, you're not going to know how or when they're going to work out. And, it's like I got my legs blown off in 2011. A year and a half later, I was on top of Mount Kilimanjaro. At that point, I realized that season of loss had ended and the season of conquering had began. Even though I'm still missing my legs, that season of hardship and suffering had moved on. So as is required in life from time to time, when you got to shift down the lower gear and take it one foot in front of the other, do so and see it through, because things always get better, and this life is meant to be lived. And, if you ever dig a hole deep down into the earth, or even just 6 foot down and look all what's going on 6 foot below the ground, it ain't a whole lot. There's no excitement of life, no delicious cuisine and, music or, whatever one enjoys to, do with their time, friends and family. So, we're all in this together and keep on going,
Well, thanks so much, Mark. It's been a pleasure chatting with you and getting to know more about you.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it.